Hello and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. So, Wizards of the Coast has dropped a bomb on us here. Um, the standard format is going to be extending to 3 years, as opposed to 2. I know I've said a lot on this channel about rotation at different points when I'm talking about the deck building toolbox series. I often mention, whether a card's going to rotate in the fall or not going to rotate, that kind of thing. Well, it's not as big of a consideration now because we're going to have them for an extra year. I mean, personally, I don't feel that much of an urge to avoid crafting something until you get up to about the 3-month mark or so for when a new set's about to come out. So, sometime around June, July is when I might be saying, I don't want to make any more Innistrad cards in my collection here. Well, they're going to be around another year, so yeah, this is the article, Revitalizing Standard. You can check it out on the website. They also have a related article with a link right here talking about how Alchemy is going to stay on a 2-year rotation. But I wanted to talk about this idea of having a 3-year standard. Some of the ins and outs, pluses and minuses that we're going to be looking at for that. And examining the reasoning that they give here, which I'm not sure are the real reasons. Let's take a look. So they say this will give current standard cards more longevity. That's hard to argue with. So, and actually this point as a free-to-play player is kind of a big deal. It means that, if I filled out my collection well when I was playing Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow, then I've got a lot of those tools still in my toolbox that I can come and build decks with. And that's nice. There's still useful removal, useful aggro creatures, useful utility pieces that still get played in standard. So having more life out of your free-to-play cards is nice, because I talked about recently in a video I call Real Talk, was in the title somewhere, about how it's difficult as a free-to-play content creator to actually get enough of the new cards to make a lot of new decks for standard when a set just comes out, because you're spending all of your time trying to gather up resources from the new set with your free-to-play account. So yeah, more longevity for sure. Point number 2, it will allow mechanics and archetypes to be more effectively built on over time. Maybe. That could be possible if they choose to do so. We'll see. So he says, as we moved away from the block model, and we're going to get back to the block model here in just a second. We're going to chat about that. We gained a lot of flexibility. We also lost some ability to build on mechanics and themes within a set. With a longer window, we can find more opportunities to build up or revitalize archetypes. Coupled with the point above, that can lead to more diversity, longer-lasting archetypes, enough competitive churn to keep players engaged. The last bit sounds a little bit like corporate buzzwords or something, but anyway. Revitalizing archetypes is an interesting notion. They could design sets that way. They could, look to actually rotate back around to vampires, or toughness matters, or things that people cared about in the Innistrad sets, or at least in limited in the Innistrad sets. Werewolves, spirits. Sure, maybe in the 3-year span, that cards stay in standard, they can start designing sets to bring some of those mechanics back around. It's possible. It'd be interesting, for sure. Especially if something rotates back in that hasn't been a thing for 3 years, and then suddenly more support comes in at the 11th hour, and maybe it gets to be a deck in standard for a few months. That'd be interesting. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the third point. I'm going to kind of tie points 2 and 3 together here a little bit. Also gives us stronger tools to create an environment where decks are more color and mechanic. Like green-white toxic or blue-white soldiers are examples that are given here. And less mid-range, meaning kind of like less good stuff decks, where you just kind of jam in the cards that have the most value. With a larger card pool, the format can handle bigger swings with entire decks seeded at once. What they're implying with this statement is that they could push the power level of sort of like a parasitic mechanic. And what I mean by parasitic here, I don't mean that it's like toxic to the game, like it's a parasite. It's kind of speech that Mark Rosewater uses in his design articles to talk about the different cards of design. Parasitic mechanics like toxic or even a creature type deck like soldiers means that it feeds in upon itself. You see a card that cares about knights. You see a card that cares about poison counters. Well, you want to keep putting more of that and more of that into your deck, and maybe if the synergy reaches a critical mass, the cards are suddenly good enough to play. But you can't go putting a lot of off synergy cards into that deck, right? Because of the way the mechanic works, where it doesn't play well with others, it needs more and more and more of itself, like soldiers or poison counters. Then it's hard to fit new cards into that archetype and to bring anything new to that deck. You can print more soldiers. That doesn't seem too crazy, right? So creature type decks can get kind of odd synergy pieces later in standard. Toxic, on the other hand, they randomly going to add toxic back into another standard set while Phyrexia All Will Be One is still legal. Is that going to be a thing? And if they do, is that deck even going to be palatable? Yeah, toxic is kind of a weird, specific mechanic. It's very narrow, it's very parasitic in design terms, where doesn't play well with others, needs more of itself to really be a thing. The opposite of a parasitic mechanic is a modular mechanic, right? So a good example of like a modular card is like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, or even more than that. Let's go with Reckoner Bankbuster. Now, of course, those are very powerful examples of modular cards, but they're cards that just, if you're in the color, or if you have the time and inclination to run it, like if you're not an aggro deck that wants to curve out with all 1-drops or something, then the cards almost always make your deck a little bit better, or they're at least an option. They're a tool that exists in the toolbox. Could go into just about any kind of deck. So modular cards like that, sometimes they feed into these mid-range strategies that he's highlighting here. But sometimes modular cards like that can also feed unexpectedly to other kinds of decks, like a combo deck. We haven't seen a lot of combo decks recently in Standard. They're a big deal in older formats. They've been a pretty big deal for most of Magic's history. I don't love combo decks, but they are a thing. And sometimes those modular cards that can, do different things and wear different hats work very well in combo decks. But not if you put hard limits on them, like it happens once per turn, or triggers 3 times and does X. Well, obviously, there's a limit on how much value that card can create. It can't combo off. So since it can't be a combo deck, instead it just is a mid-range card. That's a design choice that you have to make when you design a card. Is whether you want the possibility of a combo deck, or if it's just going to be kind of a good stuff card. Where Reckoner Bankbuster, it's not going to combo, it's not going to go infinite. Don't really see any way for it to do so. You can add counters to it, but that doesn't make it go infinite. You could even untap it, but no, it's just a good, solid, useful card that makes your deck better. Can be an attacker, can be a blocker, can draw you cards, goes in any color, etc. But it's not a combo piece. Anyway, so modular card design and parasitic design is a thing. And I'm not sure that a larger card pool necessarily fixes the problem. Like I said, some types of decks, like creature type decks, it's easy to slip a few of those into a new set as long as that creature exists in the world that you're printing cards for. And maybe they're about to change how they release worlds now. There seem to be like pathways between the planes and portals and such, and there's not planeswalking so much anymore, so maybe there's a little bit more intermixing that happens between the planes now. But yeah, some things like Toxic would be really difficult to introduce a handful of cards into a new setting for. They could do something like a mini set, kind of like what they're doing with Aftermath, where it has nothing to do with the storyline, or very little, and they just introduce some cards that could spruce up some of the other archetypes of Standard. That'd be interesting. Right, just, oh, this isn't a complete set, it's not meant for draft, we're just going to toss in some things that might spruce up some of these old Standard sets that have been around for a long time. Here you go. See if they work. But based on what we've seen in the past, I'll just say I'm taking this with a grain of salt. They need to make some big changes in terms of design in order to follow through on this. And leading back into point number 2 here, the block model. They believe they can build up or revitalize old archetypes. That happens occasionally. You see it occasionally happen with older formats. Sometimes a card will get printed and it's just enough to push some tribe like Elves or Merfolk or something back up to the forefront again in one of the older formats, maybe even an Eternal format. But I find a lot of the time that archetypes that only matter within a particular block, or a particular, we don't even have blocks anymore, in a particular set, tend to be kind of restricted, a little finite. Often those things have trouble escaping into the wild and seeing kind of the open, freeform, modular design where things that support that deck can exist in other sets and other new expansions that come out. So I have my doubts. I think it's possible to do it, but again, it'd be a big change. But in terms of whether a 3-year standard would be good or not, so I don't know if some of you watching remember playing in block legal formats. So blocks used to be like the big fall set followed by 2 small sets, and the 3 sets together formed a block, and you drafted them together. They were meant to be played together, and they even had their own constructed format, which was block constructed. And the cards from that block were, I believe, the only thing you could play in the block. Maybe the core sets could be played in with the block as well, maybe not. It's been long enough I've forgotten whether the core sets were included. So block formats had pluses and minuses. They rotated quickly. So if you didn't like a block format, well, you just had to wait till next fall, right? You're not going to see the same block format for longer than a year. You get the big set, 2 small sets, and if you're sick of it by that point, well, here's a new block. So rotation was at a pretty rapid clip. The downside is the card pool was small. Smaller even than it is now because it was 2 small sets with 1 big set instead of like 3 big sets, which is what you'd be used to at this point. Every set is like a big set now, except for Aftermath. So it was easier to have a small card pool like that be dominated by 1 or 2 of the best decks, and it kind of degenerates to where maybe there's only 2 playable decks. Maybe there's only 1 best deck, really, and then another deck that tries to disrupt the best deck. Magic is riddled with examples over its history. There is Combo Winter from Urza's Saga block. Or in Mercadian Masks, which followed pretty hot on its heels. It was a very weak format, but it had 2 best decks, basically, that just ran roughshod over everything else in the format, which were Rebels and the, what was it, Rising Waters? It was a blue enchantment, puts flood counters on things, turns them into islands. Anyway, those 2 decks were the best decks of Mercadian Masks, and they were both slow. Fairly slow. So block formats could have this problem where they were, very degenerative, where they get completely overtaken by something and it's hard for anything else to break into it. Mirrodin obviously would have been like Affinity for artifacts, Ravager Affinity, that kind of stuff. So, a short rotation time doesn't necessarily fix everything, right? You might get sick of cards being in the format a long time. There are benefits to a longer format, though. So, benefits to a longer standard. There is more card longevity. There's more value. You get to experiment with your older cards for longer. You get more value out of your older cards for longer. It's good if you're free to play. It means once you build up that collection and have put in all that time, you really start to feel a lot of value once you reach a certain threshold. And a bigger card pool does lead to often a more diverse format. Really and truly, if you go look at some of the older formats like Modern, Vintage, Legacy, and look up like what are the top 20 best decks that exist in these formats, you can actually find 20 decks. They'll be in tier rankings and stuff, and these are the best ones, and these are the second best ones, and these are the third best ones, but you'll probably find 20 or more decks for those old formats. That's what the big card pool can do. The big card pool, maybe you're not playing the best deck, but you're playing a deck that you like, and it has some ability to compete. That's nice. It is nice. The downside is maybe in Standard, once in a while, the very best deck punches so far above its weight that nothing knocks it out for 3 years. And then, 3 years later, you're still looking at Sheoldred and Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Reckoner Bankbuster and Wandering Emperor and a number of other cards I could name. And they're just still around. Invoke Despair. If nothing manages to displace the best cards, the top decks, then you could get really, really sick of them. So, how best to fix this? Well, I saw another content creator, Dev from the Place, Strictly Better MTG. He believes that they're printing too many commander cards in standard sets, and they should print more impactful cards in standard, which is an interesting take. I'd have to examine my thoughts on it a little bit to give you how I really feel about that. But it's interesting. Something I've noticed is it feels like they're putting more utilitarian effects at upper rarities, which I don't like. Don't give me my utility cards as rares and mythics. I want my utility cards as commons and uncommons. Just put more playable stuff at the common and uncommon slots. And I think that would go a long way towards addressing a lot of problems. If some of the best cards are commons and uncommons, people get to experiment with them more because more people have access to them. But I think one of the things they might do to fix this might actually be to introduce another format. You heard it here. It's my hot take. This is what I think Wizards is probably angling to do. If they're going to make Standard a 3-year format, right, they've already experimented the other direction. Right, they had a 1.5-year Standard some years back. You might have seen Power Dragon mention that. I remember that too. They tried it. People didn't like it. They went back to 2 years. But that would have been to try to fix kind of the opposite problem, right? Of people getting tired of a stale format instead of wanting more value from their cards. And I think what they do is they just introduce kind of a faster standard. I don't know what you would call that format. I'm going to call it hot potato. Yep, we're going to call it hot potato format. So I'm not sure what hot potato looks like exactly. From the problems with block constructed, I would say that even with the 3 large set model, that 3 sets probably isn't enough card pool. You could probably get into some weird problems with only the 3 most recent sets. It would rotate quickly, for sure. Maybe going back to a 1.5-year rotation would be interesting. You know, it could be like 3-year standard and then like this half standard hot potato. That's for a year and 6 months. Or maybe trim it down to like the most recent 4 sets of standard, something like that. I think introducing another format would probably be a way to sidestep some of those issues. We'll see. Anyway, in practice, I have not found that larger card pools help parasitic mechanics like Toxic. To a small extent, it can help decks like Soldiers, but if it's not a full expansion's worth of stuff, that's like a creature type deck. If you just kind of put a soldier here and a soldier there, maybe you can be coy about it and seed a bunch of good soldiers over time into the format. But if there's not like a dedicated set of good soldiers that comes out again at some point in Standard, then I think the soldier deck just kind of gets weaker and weaker and weaker. You really have to put forth effort to keep it in play. The Toxic deck, I don't even know how you handle that without either printing a weird small set of cards that can just take whatever mechanic you want and jam it in there, or revisiting a parasitic mechanic like Toxic a second time in Standard, which seems dangerous. Anyway, that's my news. That's my take for now. It's interesting that they're leaving Alchemy on a 2-year rotation because they... let's look over at that article for a second. Here's their reasoning for why they're going to keep alchemy on a 2-year rotation. It's a different environment than tabletop. It's built for digital first high volume players. They want to see regular changes in the meta because they're playing tons of games every week. That's also true of Standard on Arena. It's also true of Standard. A lot of Standard players don't like alchemy. 2-year rotation will help keep the alchemy meta dynamic and fluid, give players more change week to week and month to month in the decks they're seeing and chasing. So, I feel like this change to Standard might actually be to try to save paper Standard. Because Arena, I don't know that Arena really wants this change to Standard at all. It could have positive benefits. It could make it a more diverse format. You know, the timing is bad right at this moment because we're in an old Standard that was ready to rotate. So of course we're not going to like the way that feels right now. But it could be good in the big picture, in the long term. But the fact they're doing this for alchemy means they recognize the problem. And they're probably going to have to do something else to address this problem on Arena, because alchemy isn't enough. There are lots of players that like Standard and don't like alchemy. So I feel like the option here, the choice they're probably going to do is to introduce Hot Potato. A new constructed format that rotates faster than Standard. Other than that, they have to do some weird stuff. We'll see. That's all I got to say for the moment. If you like what I have to say, if you find this interesting, please subscribe. Please hit the like button. You could even hit the notification bell if it suits you. And until next time, stay cool.